Well, today in this program, I'm going to focus on three matters. One is the military situation in Ukraine. The second is the economic situation in Russia. We've now had some interesting data. And the third is the political situation in Pakistan, which is unfolding as I speak, and which, by the way, has resonated not just in Pakistan, but around the world. Firstly, let's talk about the military situation. Now, over the weekend, today being a Saturday, I'm afraid that information from the battlefronts tends to slow to a trickle, but nonetheless, it's possible to get some overall sense of what's going on. Firstly, there's now video pictures, which I've seen, which seem to show conclusively that the Russians and their allies, the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, and also the Chechens, who are members of the Russian National Guard, have managed to gain control of around 70% of the port area of Mariupol. This is one of the last three holdouts of Ukrainian forces in Mariupol. Over the course of last week, the Russians cleared the Ukrainian forces from the residential districts. This is essentially confirmed by journalists on the ground, and have pushed them into the more industrial regions, one of which was the port, the second was the Ilyich factory, and the third was the giant Azovstal steelworks. Now, the port area, as these reports say, is now 70% under the control of the Russians and their allies. I'm not sure how one comes up with these statistical calculations, but they do appear to be reasonably accurate, and I suspect that this is largely the case. I mean, the information does seem to show that the port area has been largely cleared of Ukrainian forces. And by the way, it turns out that there's a number of ships, merchant ships, trapped in the port with their crews on board, and they've not been able to leave because of the fighting. And obviously one has to consider their condition and the condition of those crews and the condition of those ships. Further, in other places, it's now clear that there's considerable intense fighting going on in the two factories, the Ilyich factory and the Azovstal steelworks, the latter being the major remaining point which the Ukrainian forces still control, where they've dug themselves in and where they've essentially established what some Russians are describing as a virtual fortress. These being industrial areas, however, the Russians have brought in heavy artillery, and their troops are able to get artillery support in a way that previously they were not getting whilst they were fighting in the residential areas of the city. So nobody knows. I'm not seeing any real claims as to how quickly the fighting in these three places, the steelworks, the Ilyich factory and the port, are likely to continue. But the overall plan, to the extent I can make it out, is that the Russians seem to be trying to push all Ukrainian forces into the Azovstal steelworks, concentrate them all there, and carry out the final coup de grace, the final destruction of the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol, in the steelworks. Now, the Russians say that there were 14,500 Ukrainian troops in Mariupol at the start of the siege. They put the number of remaining Ukrainian troops at just 3,000, which is a massive reduction in numbers. The Russians are sticking to these figures. I do hope that the bulk of these troops, these Ukrainian troops, either surrendered or were captured after they were wounded. I hope that the casualties are not in the tens of thousands of dead, which these figures might suggest. We'll see. I would say that I'm seeing lots of pictures, lots of film coming out of various Russian sources of Ukrainian prisoners in Mariupol. I'm not going to provide any links to videos like that. I personally find those sort of videos deeply distressing, and though I have to watch them because they're necessary for me to get an overall assessment of the situation, I watch them entirely without any relish. Now, I would finish on the topic of Mariupol by saying that the Russian military have now, for the first time, to my knowledge, said that they've intercepted communications in the Azovstal steelworks in European languages other than Ukrainian and Russian, which they seem to be saying confirms the presence of foreign mercenaries, as they put it, in the Azovstal steelworks. That's an official Russian Ministry of Defense statement. And they refer to these people in the Azovstal steelworks as mercenaries, which would appear to rule out the claims that I've seen in some places, in fact in many places, that these are somehow serving troops of drawn from NATO armies. There's been lots of wild rumours as to who exactly is in the Azovstal steelworks, rumours triggered by these rather desperate and hopeless attempts to evacuate people from the Azovstal steelworks, which have resulted in Ukraine losing at least 5 helicopters. Well, I'm not going to comment on this further. As I said, we'll find out, no doubt, eventually who is in the steelworks, and we'll see whether or not these people are mercenaries, or whether they're something else, or whether perhaps they don't exist at all. I think we just have to wait and see. I would say that there's been much discussion from various sides about the missile strike on Kramatorsk. It is now universally accepted that the missile that was used was a Tochka U. I think the photographic evidence makes that conclusive. I have to say that the fact that it was a Tochka U does make it more difficult for me to accept that it was the Russians who launched this missile. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence that the Russians have used Tochka U's in Ukraine at any point in the war. And I find it very difficult to understand anyway why they would have launched this missile strike on the railway station in Kramatorsk at a time when, as far as I can see, they want civilians to leave rather than stay in these cities. But that's all I'm going to say about this. Always I come back to the point that we need these affairs to be properly investigated, and so far they have not been. I would just finish by making one further observation. The Ukrainians initially appear to have claimed that the missile that hit the railway station was an Iskander missile, which was also a missile that the Russians do actually used, and it seems they've had to they corrected their information after the photographs that it was a Tochka U appeared. And of course there have been some very interesting analyses of what that means. There's one, for example, which has been done by the Moon of Alabama, Bernhardt being the writer there, who's a former German military officer and who has technical understanding and knowledge of these sort of things, which I straightforwardly admit I don't. All I would say about it, and I come back to what I said, is that this incident cries out for investigation. But of course, I don't expect that an objective investigation, a truly independent investigation of what took place is ever going to happen. Anyway, that's Mariupol, that is Kramatorsk. The fighting in Kramatorsk, this strike in Kramatorsk, basically should be understood in the context of the overall battle for eastern Ukraine. As I said in my previous video, I don't understand what Jens Stoltenberg was talking about when he said that it would be weeks before the battle in Donbass got started, because as far as I can see, it's very much ongoing. And the major front there, the front that really matters as far as I can see, is the northern front, with the Russians steadily and purposefully pushing forward or pushing south from the town of Izium, which they captured about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, anyway, some days ago, and pushing south towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where, as I discussed in my last program, the Ukrainian forces seem to be trying to concentrate in order to make their stand. For the rest, I would say that the Russians have continued their aerial campaign across Ukraine. They've been launching missile strikes all over Ukraine, targeting the transportation system, ammunition dumps, fuel facilities, and of course Ukraine's heavily depleted armoured vehicle fleet, which is now, if one believes Russian figures, which by the way I generally do on this issue at least, have now been reduced to about a fifth of their former level. I would add that the decision, NATO decision, to transfer from Slovakia to Ukraine this S-300 system, which there have been pictures of Slovakia, of it, going on Slovak trains and trundling eastwards, is not going to make any difference to the aerial campaign at all. I understand that Slovakia anyway had only a small number of missiles to the system, and the system was actually provided by the former Soviet Union to Czechoslovakia, its former Warsaw Pact ally, at some time in the 1980s. The S-300, I should explain, is not a single missile or system. It's actually a very wide family of systems, some of them rather old, others much more modern and far more advanced. This is one of the very original systems dating back to the 1980s. Of course, it's highly likely that the Slovaks, with NATO assistance, have to some extent modernized this system, but the Russians have shown no difficulty destroying anti-aircraft systems, Ukrainian anti-aircraft systems across Ukraine. They've destroyed a significant number of Ukrainian S-300 systems. I don't think this particular system that Slovakia is supplying, is going to make any difference to the battle at all. For what it's worth, I think this is true of pretty much all the weapon systems that NATO has supplied or is likely to supply. I think that this is, in this kind of vast conventional battle that we're talking about, NATO is simply not in a position to provide from its own rather limited stocks the kind of weapon systems that Ukraine would need in order to achieve any kind of standstill or victory. And I think everybody in NATO who is any kind of military person or who has any understanding of logistics has already figured that out. Anyway, that brings me on to the other topic, because of course this topic is the economic war of attrition that has been fought between the West and Russia over the last few weeks. And we've now had a certain amount of economic data from the Russians, and we've also had a very interesting decision by the Russian central bank. First of all, we've had an industrial readout, a manufacturing readout in March, which showed that industrial production in Russia in March rose by 4.5%. There's some question about what that actually means, whether this was simply an increase in oil and gas production, or whether this is companies using up old stocks of Western materials that have been imported as they try to meet demand. But the Russian Prime Minister seemed to be confident in an address that he made to the Russian government that the Russians would be able to replace all supply line problems, all the problems of supply lines within a period of 6 months to a year. Meanwhile, Russia has also provided inflation numbers for March, and these show an annualized inflation rate of 14.7%. Now that seems high, but I would say that given that we probably have double-digit inflation in most Western states, and given that Russian inflation numbers, by contrast, are known and accepted to be extremely reliable, I suspect that the reality is that inflation in Russia, that this inflation rate, this headline inflation rate of 14.7%, is accurate, and it does not seem to me to be so far out of line with global inflation trends. Moreover, we have had a very interesting review of the inflation situation from the Russian Central Bank. And they say that annual inflation will continue to rise due to the base effect over the next few weeks, months. Yet the latest weekly data point to a noticeable slowdown in the current price growth rates, including owing to the ruble's exchange rate dynamics. The tightening of monetary conditions already in place is partly offset by the lending support programs by the government and the Bank of Russia, but it will continue to limit pro-inflationary risks. Well, that suggests that the peak of price growth in Russia may have already passed, and though the overall inflation number may rise due to statistical reasons for a certain period longer, we will probably start sometime around midsummer to see a notable decline in headline inflation in Russia, though I'm not going to try and give a guesstimate as to what level it will fall to this year. This is in line, by the way, with Russian Central Bank Chair Elvira Nabulina's predictions of a few weeks ago that inflation would rise significantly this year, but would fall back into single figures next year, and would finally hit the central bank's 4% target in 2024. So whatever perspective you take of this, it doesn't amount to hyperinflation or anything close to it. And in fact, another thing which the central bank is not saying is that it seems that the key products that most Russians rely upon, and which are of course essential in terms of their own living standards and their own perception of where they stand, food and fuel costs have remained relatively stable, at least for the time being. With Russia, of course, self-sufficient in both food and energy, that is not entirely surprising, though I would say that sanctions pressure might eventually cause increases in the prices of these products as well. But anyway, regardless, it doesn't seem as if Russia is facing anything like a hyperinflation crisis. On the contrary, it's looking as if its inflation numbers will be only marginally higher this year than those of several countries in the West. Spain, after all, has already given an inflation readout, which puts inflation at only just below 10%. So that seems to be a stabilizing trend in terms of price figures in Russia. But perhaps the situation, the even more interesting situation, is that the central bank, as I said, points to a noticeable slowdown in current price growth, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of what we're seeing in the West. The trend in Russia, the overall trend, is for inflation to start to fall, whereas the trend in the West, as anybody who spends time shopping or paying bills, is for inflation to rise. And that, no doubt, explains the Bank of Russia's decision on Friday to cut interest rates by 300 base points from 20% per annum to 17% per annum from 11th April 2022. And the central bank explains it in this way. External conditions for the Russian economy are still challenging, considerably constraining economic activity. Financial stability risks are still present, but have ceased to increase for the time being, including owing to the adopted capital control measures. There is a steady inflow of funds to fixed-term deposits. Annual inflation will continue to rise due to the base effect, yet the latest weekly data point to a noticeable slowdown in the current price growth rates, including owing to the ruble's exchange rate dynamics. The tightening of monetary conditions already in place is partly offset by the lending support programs launched by the government and the Bank of Russia, but it will continue to limit pro-inflationary risks. Today's decision to reflect a change in the balance of risks of accelerated consumer price growth, decline in economic activity, and financial stability risks. In its further key rate decisions, the Bank of Russia will take into account risks posed by external and domestic conditions and the reaction of financial markets, as well as the actual and expected inflation dynamics relative to the target and economic developments over the forecast horizon, and holds open the prospect of further key rate reduction at its upcoming meetings. Now, translated into ordinary English, what this says is the worst in the inflation situation may be over, financial stability is returning, bank deposits are growing, the financial system is working stably. So the point has now come when the central bank can now start to lower interest rates in order to support the economy and to help the process of economic recovery in general from whatever low point has been hit in the February-March period. So these words, though very carefully expressed and leaving no hostages to fortune, point to an overall improving economic picture. Now, again, that is perhaps not the situation in the West. In the West, we're increasingly hearing stories about gas shortages, oil shortages. There's again resumptions of talk about rationing. And anybody who goes to the shops knows that inflation dynamics are actually intensifying across the Western economies. And there's increasing warnings, including one from Bank of America, that the United States economy is heading for recession, heavy recession, and that there is also increasing concerns that the same may be true in Europe, perhaps to a much greater extent. And I would add that as the Russian central bank seems ever so prudently and ever so carefully and always leaving its options open, but as the Russian central bank is moving towards gradually reducing interest rates, Western central banks, led first and foremost by the Federal Reserve Board, are moving ever so gingerly towards increasing interest rates, with the Federal Reserve Board now talking about the need to tighten monetary policy by more than expected. David Stockman, who knows something about economic matters, believes for one, that this tightening of monetary policy by the Federal Reserve Board is real for this time, that there's no option but to do it if inflation, price growth in Western economies is to be brought under control, and if the position of the dollar is to be secured. And he also predicts that this is going to lead to a severe crisis in the financial markets in the West, leading to a severe recession in the United States. Well, we'll see whether he's right. Others, no doubt, have different views. But anyway, we will see how this works out. But at the moment, all the indications are a stabilizing economic picture in Russia, an inflation problem where the worst may be over, even if the headline rate rises for statistical reasons over the next few weeks and perhaps months, and where industrial production has risen, and where the central bank feels able to lower interest rates, whereas in the West we see rising interest rates, rising inflation, and increasing concerns about falls in industrial and manufacturing activity, leading perhaps to a recession. I cannot believe that this is what those people who got together, the G7 officials who got together back at the end of February, expected when they rolled out the sanctions wall. I would repeat again the warning that I have made in previous programs. The fact that for the moment the Russians appear to be winning the sanctions war is not a cause for celebration, certainly not worldwide. It is on the contrary a cause for concern, because it seems to me that all that's going to do is it's going to make Western leaders and Western governments that have heavily invested in this policy, Western politicians, even more angry, even more determined to strike out at the Russians, even more anxious to try to achieve what they failed to achieve when they did what they did back in February. And of course that leaves open the possibility of more dramatic and very dangerous measures, particularly on the military front, that could have consequences which I would rather not contemplate, at least not in this program. So that's what I wanted to say about the general situation in the economic war, which is playing out at the same time as the military struggle is playing out within Ukraine itself. But of course, as I've often said, this isn't just an economic war between the West and Russia. It's not just a diplomatic struggle. It's not just a military struggle. It is a global crisis. And we see now how that global crisis has extended to a political crisis in Pakistan. Now, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, has up to now pursued a policy of neutrality. He's tried to keep Pakistan neutral in this crisis. The United States has been extremely unhappy about this, and so it seems have some members of the Pakistani establishment, many of whom no doubt have long-standing reasons to be hostile to Imran Khan. And amongst the people who are clearly unhappy with Imran Khan are the Pakistani military, who have a long-standing history of alliance with the United States, and also other members of the political class. And a few days ago, there was the Imran Khan's coalition government broke down. His opponents in parliament put forward a no-confidence vote. The no-confidence vote was blocked by the deputy speaker of the parliament. The president of Pakistan dissolved the parliament and called fresh elections. And this caused many people to think that this operation, which many people see, I certainly see, as essentially an orchestrated, externally orchestrated move engineered by the United States to bring down the Pakistani government. Anyway, many people thought that these moves would lead to an election which Imran Khan would win, and that this would somehow defeat this regime change operation. Well, I've never said that in any video. I've always been much more skeptical about the nature of politics in Pakistan. I should say that this goes back in historical terms to periods when I had, shall we say, dealings with Pakistan, and it struck me that the country overall, many people in the country overall, are very honest. There are ways, nonetheless, for people with deep pockets to buy influence there in a way that is inconceivable in the West. And I always thought that there was a high probability that the Supreme Court would reverse the president's decision. And so, predictably, it has done. So, over the course of today, I expect this vote of no confidence in the parliament to take place. I expect Imran Khan's government to be dismissed. I expect a new pro-American government to be installed in Pakistan. By the time you've seen this program, all that I have just said would probably have happened. And I expect this government to then take steps to make sure that when the elections do finally take place in October this year, they are arranged in such a way that Imran Khan cannot win them. In saying that, I don't know what the political mood in Pakistan is. All I will say about this is that these machinations will probably undermine Pakistan's political stability. It will undermine support for the West in Pakistan. I understand that the mood in the country is already very pro-American already, and this is going to make it even more anti-American already, and this is going to make it even more anti-American than it already is. But perhaps more importantly, this has resonated internationally. So there's already been statements from China, Iran, and importantly Turkey, condemning what they see as the external interference, orchestration of politics in Pakistan to bring Imran Khan down. And perhaps the country that is most important here is Turkey, where President Erdogan of Turkey is, to put it mildly, deeply suspicious of the US and of the Western powers. He's widely believed to suspect that there was a Western hand in the coup attempt against him in 2016. And I suspect that what's happened in Pakistan is going to reinforce his fears and those of other members of the Turkish political elite who are aligned with him. Now, it does seem to me that Pakistan is obviously an important country, but that the United States should have gone to all this trouble to engineer this kind of crisis in Pakistan. I gather American officials have actually been caught having discussions with members of the opposition as they've lobbied for Imran Khan's fall. All I can say is that this seems to me to be a foolish expenditure in political capital and resources to bring down a prime minister in a country like Pakistan. Maybe it will alarm some countries, some leaders in some countries, and make them, as a result, more willing to toe the American line. But I have to say, I think it's more likely overall to make countries like the Solomon Islands, which Alex Christoforo and I on the Duran have just done a program about, the leaders of countries like that feel that they have to be extremely careful with the United States and look to others for help in ensuring their security. The Solomon Islands, of course, has turned to China, and who knows, other countries may do so before long as well. So I think that this was a pointless expenditure of resources